Hello, everybody. Hi, hello. We are live. This is the WastED webinar. It is a webinar that is hosted by the Leftovers Foundation, talking about food waste in Edmonton. My name is Garnet. I am the city coordinator for Leftovers in Edmonton. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the host. This is our 6th webinar and our very first one in person, so we're very excited about that. Today, we're talking with a couple of people from the University of Alberta. I'd like to just do a quick land acknowledgement. We are on Treaty 6 territory. That's traditional land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, Nakota, Métis, and many other First Nations. And it's important for us to ground with that and recognize that, especially as we're talking about things like food waste that are very inherent to Western and settler culture, rather than Indigenous people's culture, and what might we be able to learn from Indigenous people, and how might we be able to address the current struggles of Indigenous people in food security and food sovereignty. With that, I would like to introduce our two guests. Farrah So is a master's student at the University of Alberta studying food waste in Alberta, and Goddard is a professor at the University of Alberta in agricultural and life sciences. Is that right? Close enough. Welcome very much. Welcome to the Late WastED webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, and Ellen, I'll start with you, and we'll start off just with a little foundation of food waste from the academic perspective. How do you study food waste? And maybe if you talk about food loss and waste and what the differences between those two are.
Okay, so I'll start with the last bit first. Food loss is definitely something that we've worried about for a long time, but largely from a developing country perspective, because we know there is a lot of loss in food between farms producing food and it actually getting to consumers in the marketplace because of lack of refrigeration, lack of other infrastructure to move food, hard to keep mice out of grain, all of that sort of stuff would reduce the available food supplies. Food waste is a much more recent phenomenon, I guess, if you think about it. And it's largely rich countries that we started worrying about food waste in. And it's enormous. There are some estimates in Canada that we waste 50% of the food we purchase. That seems enormous to me in my household, but I know that it happens if you look at the food system as a whole. And the question is, why are we wasting resources producing food that is going to landfill and wasting space in landfill and also creating greenhouse gas emissions? It's a huge problem and we can't afford it, essentially.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for that. And Farrah, you are studying food waste more locally. Could you tell us a little bit about what specifically you're studying?
For sure. So I'm doing my master's work under Dr. John Wolodko and Dr. Sven Anders at the UofA. And this work is investigating the capacity for food businesses in Alberta to manage their own food waste and what kind of values that those businesses have that influence that capacity. It's also evaluating the willingness for businesses and their preferences of businesses to engage in programs that support collaboration within the province. Yeah, so this is all being completed on an online survey. It's still online. I'd like to promote it just in case there's anyone who works for a food business around here. Please get in contact with me. But it's using some methods from social sciences like the theory of planned behavior and a vignette approach to get these results and make everything happen. So yeah, I'm very excited about it.
Very cool. And so practically that looks like you contacting food businesses and sending them this survey and they fill out the survey. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So they get to fill it in themselves. And I've just been going through directories basically and contacting people, mainly manufacturers for now, but we're moving into restaurants and retailers and grocery stores very soon.
Very cool. And how's that been? I mean, you're not finished the research yet. You're still ongoing, but what have been some of the preliminary findings and what do we see in Alberta in terms of food waste and the results?
Yeah, Alberta's very interesting. Canada as a whole is very interesting because there's not a lot of publications about food loss and waste, actually, which is a bit surprising because of how much we do actually waste. My preliminary work has basically just been a literature review for now. I've gotten some responses back, but I'm not sure I want to just close them until I get the bigger picture and the whole picture. But some key findings I can say as kind of main points that I want to convey today is firstly that we should be finding a way to measure the amount of food waste we produce. Secondly, that there needs to be more resources for businesses to and for households to reduce the amount of waste that they produce. Thirdly, that we need to figure out options for recovering and diverting food from landfill, making them more accessible, and making businesses more aware of the options that they have. And finally, considering some more robust policy options for what we can do to reduce food waste.
Fantastic, thank you. And you mentioned that it was surprising the lack of data. Is there anything else that, as you've approached that, has been surprising to you?
Yeah, I think it's surprising that we just don't have many businesses that are measuring the amount of waste that they produce. Food waste can be considered from a household perspective, but food is also wasted and lost by businesses all throughout this supply chain. So grocery stores, retailers, manufacturers, even on farm, there are losses that occur in Canada. So it's surprising to me that even though there is a large business case for reducing food, it's estimated by a similar report to the one that came out and said that half the food is wasted, that about $50 billion at retail value is wasted. So there is a case for wanting to reduce the amount that's wasted from a business perspective. That not many companies and businesses have formal policies addressing the management of food waste.
Ellen, did you have something you wanted to add there? It looked like you had your hand.
I was just going to say we don't have the incentives aligned properly. So one of the things that happened that made companies start to be concerned about wasting food was when they started being charged for extra food going to landfills. So food processing firms, for example, who might make a line of Campbell's tomato soup and find out at the end of the day, all in cans and labels and everything, that it had a little bit too much sodium in it, would not want to send that entire shipload of soup to landfill because it would show up as a negative charge on their processing. So they would look for places to distribute it, and food banks might be a place to do that. But we have to get the incentives aligned right throughout the supply chain if we're going to see really creative solutions to some of these problems.
Do you have an idea of what some of those incentives might be, and what body, would it be a government body? Would it be industry? Would it be academics? How can we line up those?
It's never academics. Nobody listens to academics. But realistically, there's a public good aspect here. If we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we're going to make food more affordable by not wasting so much of it, then there is a public good aspect. So there does need to be some level of government engagement, whether that's at the municipal, provincial, federal level, or all three of them. But there's also a private case to be made for this. And the more companies pay attention to it, the more they're finding that they can save money by doing things properly. And, you know, France had a rule that supermarkets can't throw food out anymore. And strangely, they found all kinds of creative ways of dealing with charities and food banks and other food distributors to dispose of the food rather than send it to landfill or put it in the dumpster behind the store. But France is small, big population, lots of people close together. The same solution is going to be really difficult in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, as opposed to Southern Ontario, where there's a huge volume of people in the same geographical. Like Calgary can't call Edmonton and say, we've got some extra bakery products. That's not going to work. So how are you going to get the logistics to line up is an issue.
Logistics of moving food is my day job. That's as a city coordinator of leftovers, that's trying to figure out all the different pieces. And it's really challenging to figure out where to send the food and how to optimize it all. And leftovers also only has a small piece of the puzzle of food waste in Edmonton, and some greater strategic moves and incentives would certainly be fantastic. According to research, what are some of the most effective ways to reduce food waste as a whole? Or what are some of the low-hanging fruits, and what are some of the, according the best policy maneuvers, or where in our food chain can we reduce food waste most easily, and what might that be?
Perhaps I'll get started on that one. I think there are just a tremendous number of ways that we can reduce food waste across the supply chain. ReFed, which is this group from the US, compiled a bunch of data and found out the top 3 solutions for food waste on a consumer perspective is reducing portion sizes. Sorry, there are 2 other ways that are just fleeting me right now, but it happens all across the supply chain. And if we look at food loss and waste as a whole, the report that came out said that 21% happens at the consumer level, but for the total avoidable food loss and waste, a lot of it is happening further on down the supply chain. So there's a lot of ways that we can tweak the way that industry is practicing to be able to do this better. One example is actually the Campbell's soup plant in Toronto. Provision Coalition, which is this consulting group out of Guelph, they did a study with them to identify what some of their low-hanging fruit is, and they identified they could save $700,000 a year. And one of the ways they can do that is by just pushing soup out of their many tubes at the end of the day, and that would save them a significant amount. So there are low-hanging fruit, but it's kind of spread across the entire supply chain. When it comes to policy, I guess the way that I would like to frame this is according to the food management hierarchy. So the Environmental Protection Agency has this hierarchy of what the most preferred options that we deal with food waste is, to the lowest, the least optimal. And from the top to the bottom, it's preventing it from happening, then recovering for human consumption, which is what leftovers does, but that's more food surplus, not exactly food waste. And then third down would be recovering for animal feed, recovering for fuel, and then composting, and then finally landfill and incineration. So all throughout that hierarchy, there are a lot of ways that we can move ourselves to be more optimal. And some of that has to do with reducing the costs for businesses of moving up and providing tools and resources for them to do so.
Technology also plays a role here, and we don't know enough yet, but they've come out with smart packaging that will tell you when things have spoiled and actually need to be disposed of and when they're still okay to eat. And that could change individuals' behavior quite a bit if once they trusted the technology, because a lot of stuff is being disposed of at the household level because people just don't know, or they misinterpret best before dates as being no good after dates. And those things are not true. And
can we dive? Could you explain that a little bit more? Say it louder for the people in the back.
Okay, so a best before date is basically a manufacturer's suggestion of when they think the food will be at its peak quality. And after that, the quality may be slightly lower. Does not mean it's not safe to eat, does not mean it's not going to be perfectly enjoyable to eat. And when you think about it, could be a suggestion that you rush out and buy another version of the food product or another edition rather than needs to go in the garbage for safety reasons. And that message is causing an enormous amount of food waste. Just if we could change people's understanding of that message would be helpful for this 21% at the individual household level. But so much of it is stuff that has evolved across time because we're not paying attention. So it's really a behavioral change piece that we need to. And I was thinking last night as I looked at my new green bin that I'm putting food waste in rather than my neighbor's compost bins, I was thinking, okay, so is this going to make it more obvious to people how much of what they put out as garbage is actually food being wasted? And will that make them think twice at the grocery store? And maybe grocery stores should stop having buy one, get one free options, because I suspect an awful lot of the buy one, get one free options at grocery stores are actually not consumed, but people cannot resist the concept that something is free. And as food costs go up, there's even going to be more pressure to be looking for that sort of option. So maybe if the grocery stores collectively could say that's not a sales option we're going to pursue in the future, maybe that would help. There's all all kinds of different strategies to change behavior, but people have to be aware, and that's people in companies, in grocery stores, in restaurants, as well as people at home have to be aware of what they're doing. I keep hoping the pandemic and people focusing more on food at home will have made people think twice about some of their food purchasing patterns pre-pandemic. And we don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of beautiful things that could come out of the pandemic, and fingers crossed that's one of them. Of course, we've also seen an increase in packaging and etc. that goes along with that. So it's difficult to tell where we're at and where we're going in so many ways right now. Let's move on. What are some of the barriers you found in collecting data on food waste and researching food waste?
Do you want to start?
Like I mentioned, there is a gap within the literature of data, and one of the reasons is just because it's difficult to collect data on food waste. That individuals, I don't weigh my food waste every time it goes in the bin. Most companies are not either, and so we don't have robust data on where exactly food waste is occurring and why. So one of the reasons is because it's very costly and time consuming to be able to measure all the food waste that you have every day. But there are technological solutions emerging, like apps that can help you measure, and really easy to use bins that some startups are working on for restaurants to help measure their waste easier.
Again, I'm really always concerned about the behavioral piece of all of this and how we're going to get people to change their mindset. When you think about big food companies, maybe multinational food companies, they're getting pressure from their investors now to change their behavior. And the investors are starting to ask questions like, are you really wasting food? Do you understand that that's dollars out of shareholders' pockets? It's dollars added to consumer costs. And is that good for your business? And that's all well and good because it does change the focus within the company. In some cases, though, if you don't demand complete transparency on the reporting end and you don't have the measurement piece right, you can cause hidden things to happen in the company. So the investors are pursuing the right strategies, perhaps, but we need to make sure that the transparency and the tracking and the measuring is all in place. Many food companies, particularly that purchase international ingredients, are now looking at their entire supply chain, right back to the primary farmer of vanilla in Madagascar, for heaven's sake. And all of that is for the good, because they're finding out that there are efficiencies that can be made and that they can provide financial security sometimes to small scale producers in developing countries if they pay more attention to how much is getting from point A to B to C to D to E and in what quality it is moving through the supply chain. So they're looking at making investments in developing countries that will improve the logistics and the distribution of food and might make the whole supply chain more efficient, and all to the good. But you need to have either a stick or a carrot to get these behavior changes operating properly.
What's an example of a stick?
Well, government regulation is a stick. Fees at landfill are a stick. The French government saying you cannot do this is a stick. A carrot might be tax credits. If you reduce, means you have to track before and after a change in behavior. But so sometimes the carrots work better, sometimes the sticks work better. And if you make the regulations too restrictive, then companies start working around them and you don't achieve as much, for example. But
I have a tangential question here. In Edmonton, businesses have to take care of their own waste. They pay an independent company to come take it to an independent landfill. How does that influence how businesses approach food waste? Any thoughts, or how common is that across different municipalities?
From the two municipalities that I've kind of looked at as well, which is Vancouver and Calgary. They have collection services for commercial waste. So there's pros and cons to this approach, right? Because in Edmonton, we have a great anaerobic digestion facility, but currently you can only manage household waste, right? So there's a place for all of that organic waste to be diverted to. In the case of the commercial sector in Edmonton, I'm not really sure where it's going to. I believe GFL trucks come in, pick it up. It's probably being landfilled, not necessarily being composted or anaerobically digested. So there may be better ways to manage that waste if the city was in charge, but it also means that they will have to pay for how much they're dumping. So all the dumping fees, they have to call for the GFL truck to come in and basically pick up that waste, which they have to pay for. So now there's more of an incentive for them to figure out where else that can go, which means more donations, possibly more creative solutions, like Loop, I think, which is this company that works with Save On Foods, if I'm correct.
Save On Foods and what's the great big conglomerate? Loblaws.
They work with Loblaws too.
Yeah.
Excellent. So they basically take some of the product that they have and they convert it into animal feed, and they work to distribute that animal feed. So they're working to basically be able to divert it in a better way. So companies can go out and pursue options like that instead of GFL to lower their own costs. So it's kind of a mix. In Calgary, they have commercial collection. They also have a kind of a, not necessarily a ban, but they're trying to make companies use their green bins that they have for the commercial sector. In Vancouver, they did have a ban, but that also comes with some pros and cons, which I won't get into right now, but there are some challenges there, but they do have a ban in place in Vancouver.
Are you open to getting into it?
I think the one thing I would note is that it can put pressure on community organizations like Leftovers. There was a study that came out after that ban, and they surveyed community organizations, and they were saying how there may be a bit of like a power imbalance between community organizations and larger chains, and that the community organizations were now taking on a lot of that product that was going off and managing it. But there, as you know, there's a limited amount of, capacity that you have for volunteering and for your infrastructure that you can manage that with. And if they're giving you products that are about to go off, there's not much that you can do except throw it away on your side, right? So it kind of just puts the effort onto smaller organizations and not the grocery stores itself. So lots of things to consider there.
And is that, we were talking about France earlier, and they have a similar ban, and have they found a way around that? Or is that part of the just different scales in terms of geography that we're working with?
Well, I think that the simple answer is within that policy framework, you could include a piece on the quality of food that can be passed off to these organizations, right? So if you have an agreement and a written contract, which I think they have in France, as to what quality that needs to be before you pass it off to another organization, that means that you're actually only donating stuff that can be passed on to people who need it. And the grocery stores can then deal with the rest of that themselves, either by giving it to an organization like Loop or by sending it to GFL. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's just what I was going to say.
You taught her well.
But you need this regulatory structure. You need the regulatory structure behind that to make it work. It's not just today the supermarket can't send any more stuff to waste and send it wherever you want as long as it's not going to landfill, because that's not going to work.
Yeah, certainly. I could definitely see how they put a lot of stress on charities like Leftovers and food banks. Another question I have is, we're talking about largely how to make our very complex food system more efficient. When we have these great big supply chains and trying to find where the food waste is wasted along the supply chain and reduce it at each step. Is there a case for reducing the size of the supply chain, and what effect does that have on food waste? It's very topical because we're here at the 124th Street Market with a bunch of farmers that are selling directly to their consumers.
And now you'll find out all about my confused objective functions, because I delight in local food, and I think local food is really important. And I believe that we should have access to as many short supply chains, is what we would call this, as possible. And I do think the interaction between people is really important about the food too, because people can find out what the production practices were and what things were added or not added, or how the crops were grown, all of that sort of stuff. And it's powerful stuff. But by the same token, I also recognize that we have a responsibility to people in developing countries. Regardless of the fact that we waste a lot of food, we're a rich country. And we do not want to create only short supply chains that essentially reduce the opportunities for small-scale farmers in developing countries to ever make a living. So we have to do a combination that's going to make this all work. And I do think some of the really responsible major global food retailers are working on schemes that fairly distribute revenue back along the supply chain. And they are tracking and monitoring and measuring, and they have made it more efficient. Some studies would show that perhaps importing apples by ship from New Zealand is not that bad for the environment as compared to some other products we bring in out of season from other places by air or some other container. So we need to understand this is another place where we're desperate for data. And the data changes. It changes as fuel prices change. It changes in the pandemic, for heaven's sake. They were shipping fruit on passenger seats in airplanes because they had all these planes with nothing to do with them. So they didn't have to put it underneath. They could put it right up in the cabin. But if the planes weren't flying, there was a problem getting stuff from point A to point B because some went that way. And we are an integrated world in terms of food. And I think we have to recognize that. By the same token, I love local food. So there you are.
I think the piece to look into with when we're comparing different supply chains is called life cycle assessment. And that kind of evaluates the greenhouse gas impact and may include a piece on food waste. So if you're interested in looking more into upcoming research, because we don't have a lot of that right now, that's what it may look like. But I think that just from my own personal perspective, the more that I value food, the more that I know where it comes from, the more knowledge I have about who made it, the more I value it and the less likely I am to waste it, the more I want to use it. And if I see it sitting in my fridge, I definitely want to take care of it because I know the value that went into it. So I think from a consumer perspective, these shorter supply chains give me joy. Like I love going to the farmer's market and it helps us value food more and to not waste it.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I recently signed up for a CSA program, that's community supported agriculture. So I get a box of food from my friend's farm. So it's like a couple of good friends of mine who are growing this food and they give me a box every week. And there is no way I am throwing that food out. Let me tell you that it's like so precious to me. It's like, no, this isn't just food that came from nowhere, like from the grocery store. That's not where food comes from. Like my friend Dylan grew this food. And if I throw this food out, that's disrespecting the time and energy that Dylan and Dom put into it. So yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, just another point. One other thing that we can do is probably volunteer at, the local organic farms that we have near South Campus. I did volunteering for one day. I got some produce out of it. It was hard work. We were pulling weeds for half the day, but I did not waste that food. Like I made sure all of it was made into a beautiful dish. And yeah, I think it does make us value food a lot more to know where it comes from.
Ellen, Dr. Goddard, what should you prefer? Fine. Ellen's fine. Thanks. Sorry, Ellen. Should have confirmed that earlier. Do you have that kind of influences our consumer behavior as well, like where we get our food and how we relate to our food, and that's changed throughout time. And you've also been studying this for a long time. And how have you noticed that trend in terms of us and our connection to food and where we source our food?
So it's fascinating. When you look at what goes on with farmers markets now and people wanting to grow food in their backyards and things, you're right back to the 1950s, where even coming out of the war, everybody grew food in their backyard. It was abnormal to not have a garden of some sort in your backyard. My grandmother grew so much asparagus that I thought I would never eat asparagus in the entire rest of my life. However, I now like it again. But it was that sort of thing went away. And it went away as a lot of sociologists would say when women entered the formal workforce, then some of these things became burdensome in terms of time. And then we started to buy more stuff, and we wanted more convenience, and we wanted more packaging, and all sorts of things resulted from that. And when you think about the US, 51% of a consumer's food dollar in the United States is spent on food away from home. So that's a restaurant purchase, a drive-in purchase, all of that stuff. In Canada, we're between 25 and 30% when we measure it. So we don't do as much restaurant stuff as they do in the United States. But by the same token, when you buy a prepared meal, like an already prepared meal, there's not really that much you can do with it at the end of the day if you don't want to eat it. That's where the portion size stuff comes into play. We should make portion size smaller and we would throw out less. But in the old days, I was digging through old cookbooks at my mother's house in the last few weeks. And the cookbook itself would say, you start with a Sunday roast dinner, a roast beef and vegetables and et cetera, et cetera. And these are the other 5 meals you will make a week out of that roast dinner. And so the whole concept of leftovers as being something we don't quite understand, and we're not quite sure if they're as good as a first cooked meal, was completely foreign to these people. They started off with the idea of planning for leftovers. I'll use this for my kids' lunch at schools. I'll use this part for the main meal on Tuesday. And by Friday, I'll be left with a little bit of stuff I'll make hamburgers out of, and et cetera, et cetera. And that has changed fundamentally in people's minds. Even my son, who you would think might know something about this stuff, having lived with me, is like, leftovers? I don't really think about what to do with leftovers. But leftovers, as you guys know, are an important part of food. And if we plan for it, it's easier to plan if you cook yourself and you have the ingredients in your house than it is if you buy already prepared meals. So that's a shift that maybe we'll move back.
What's coming to mind right now is shepherd's pie. Yeah. And shepherd's pie is just the leftovers put into another dish.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I think you mentioned the study earlier, ReFed, that there was coming up with the best ways to address food waste at the consumer level. And I think one of those, if I recall correctly, is also meal planning. And that being when you go into the grocery store, know what you're buying for the week. And what you're talking about, Ellen, is the next level above that. It's like, don't just know what you're planning for the next week, know what you're doing with leftovers from those meals for the next week as well.
So aside from portion sizing, actually, you just reminded me that actually one of their top ways to potentially reduce food waste is meal kits. And when I initially saw that, I was like, that's interesting, because that means that we're not really being that mindful of our food, and there's a bunch of packaging waste as well. But the reason for that is because if we have all of our food portioned out exactly how much we need, then we're not going to waste that much food, right? So on one hand, having leftovers and being able to make use of them is one thing, but there's this whole other philosophy where if we only sell as much food as people need in these small portions through these meal kit services, then there's a potential for them to be able to reduce their food waste. But there are trade-offs with packaging.
Very interesting. All right, let's go into a little less practical, a little less headspacey. What does your ideal food system look like?
I'll go first, and then Dr. Goddard can end us off. Ideal food system, just in terms of food waste, no food is going to landfill. I think there are many better ways of using it, better things to do, a lot of ways that we can prevent it. I think for food waste that we should be able to have tools to measure it, be able to have tools to reduce it, and be able to provide businesses with those tools, figure out policy that works to be able to, change systemically what that system looks like. But on a more personal note, a good food system is one where everyone has access to nutritious food, culturally appropriate food, and food security, of course, is an income issue. It's not just about the food chain itself, food supply chain itself. But I think in a country where we have a lot of abundance, it should be part of our responsibility that no one gets to go hungry.
Can't disagree with any of that. I do think choice is an important part of the food system, and partly Farrah's already talked about that in terms of culturally appropriate and accessible and affordable and all of those kinds of things. But we do have to recognize choice, and we do have to recognize diversity in people's food needs at different stages of life, diversity in family structures, diversity in cultural backgrounds, diversity in the types of meals we want to eat. We cook very differently when we have people over for dinner. We cook very differently for a big event dinner, a graduation dinner, a birthday dinner, a Christmas dinner, if you like. And we have to recognize that we're going to have that diversity, and we have to have access to that diversity to really enjoy food, because food is central to our culture in a way that I think we've taken for granted for a long time. Just being more thoughtful about food is going to improve the food system in many ways. But I seriously think a food system that recognizes and supports local food and short food supply chains, as well as big commercial farmers that are producing products that we need to export to other countries that are deficit in protein, for example. We have to put that all together to make a food system that's going to be perfect from my perspective.
That sounds really difficult and really complicated. And of course it is. We're here talking about food waste, and it's a singular issue. It's something that's happening, but it's happening at so many different places along a very complex food system. And there are so many different people that need different approaches as well. And some people have the time to, I have the time to order a CSA box and the ability to pay for it and the time to process that food if I have more of it. And some people need a meal kit to be like, no, I just need to, meal delivered to my door so that I can prep it. And some people need to go out to their local diner. And if we're looking at addressing food waste, there have to be solutions at all parts of the line. I'd like to open up for questions from the audience at this point. For those of you who have tuned in a little bit later, this is the WastED webinar in case you just dropped in, and this is our first one live, and there's a bunch of folks on Zoom. If you're on Zoom and have questions, please type them away. They will show up here on my computer magically within a minute or two. Thank you, Alicia. Any questions from out here? Yes. So I'm going to repeat that as close as I can for the folks that are on Zoom. And this is also a podcast, for those of you who didn't know. If you miss something and want to catch it later, it is a podcast that you will be able to listen to. And the question is, Ellen was talking about the stick or the carrot as being potential incentives or deterrents that might spark behavioral change for food waste. And what are some other incentives or ways that we can change people's behavior? Is that correct? So our audience member is selfishly wanting some tips right now. Summary of the question. This is my partner, Shada. She's lovely. Coincidentally interested in food waste.
I was going to say there have been some very clever things come up where people have created apps in some major urban centers. And if they make too much for dinner, they put it on the app and say, I've got leftover shepherd's pie. And if somebody can use it, I'm happy to organize it. And it turns out that some of those things work, particularly in dense urban centers where people don't need big cars to drive long distances and that sort of thing. So there are clever things like that we can use technology to communicate more about food and perhaps share things that otherwise might go to waste. I do also think, though, that we have to not be resistant to the idea of technology in things like smart packaging or in our refrigerator, for example, that will tell us about which foods. Maybe you should cook those carrots tonight, the fridge might say to you in the morning. And by the time you get home at night, you might have thought of a recipe for the carrots. But some of these things exist now. and can be done. And if we can make those things more affordable, maybe we should shrink the size of fridges. Maybe we should tell the grocery store, if you don't get rid of buy one, get one free, I'm going to shop somewhere else. I mean, all of these things can be things that we do if we know that the options exist to do them. I don't know.
If anyone wants to do this refrigeration technology, I'm very interested. I've thought about it a lot. I would love to work with you. Two things came to my mind when you asked your question. The first is incentives for businesses. So there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that don't meet the grading and the size requirements in grocery stores. And one way that they've been able to kind of figure out a stream for those products is firstly selling them at a discount before they reach their best before date or before they go off as products. So Flash Food is one of those businesses that actually has an app where consumers can look for those foods at a discount. I think they're available at Superstore. The other thing they've done is these no-name naturally perfect foods. So they have these giant bags of frozen berries that are like half the price of the other berries that I really like to buy. And I can't even believe that they may have been throwing these things away before they became these frozen berries. So if you can find streams to create new products for businesses where they can, have a new product and make some extra cash out of it by reducing food waste, that's a great incentive for them. The other more cultural thing which came to mind was something I read about called the good provider identity. And this is something I resonated with a lot because my mom is definitely like a good provider and she tries to be this way for my family. But the good provider identity is this trait where you want to be able to provide, seem like a good provider by providing like excess food at meal times, making sure you have a lot of groceries that are always available. And in that way, there may be some times when you are kind of overdoing it with the amount of food that you provide. And so you produce more leftovers. There may be more food that you need to cook at the end of the week. And if we can, talk to our family members and say, hey, we don't need to order this much. Like the amount that we have is perfectly fine. Or figure out ways around that. I think that's one way that we can support each other to reduce the amount of waste we have. Because culturally, at least in my household, that's happened a few times. Yeah.
I definitely see it when we're hosting events, or I have my friends over, and if the food runs out, I feel bad. And that's like if there isn't leftovers, I feel bad. And yeah, that's like a cultural piece that is something we could absolutely change. Any other questions? So to repeat the question, it's what is the biggest misconception that you found in researching food waste compared to where you started and what you know now?
I think that this issue is immensely challenging compared to what I initially thought. One of the first reports that I read was from Environment Climate Change Canada, and it lists all these ways that we can reduce food waste across the supply chain. I recommend you read it if you're interested. And at first glance, all these things seem very simple, and some of them may be, but I think implementing them does take a lot of work and a lot of information and convincing for businesses and for individuals. And changing behavior can be a very simple thing, but oftentimes it does take some work. So no,
not simple.
Not simple. So that's the thing that I thought. I thought this would be a very easy problem, but as I've read more and as I've learned more, it's actually difficult. But there are things we can do to work on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, once you've behaved a certain way for even 10 years, it's really hard to get you to switch your brain on and change your behavior, because so many things become automatic because we don't have time to make all of those decisions in our brain every day. But I think the thing that surprised me the most, and maybe I reacted negatively, was when I started looking at all the studies measuring food waste. And I was stunned by this common statistic that comes out country after country after country, that the majority of the food waste is at the household level. And I thought, this is crazy. Like, why would a household continually throw out food to the point where they're one of the biggest contributors to food waste? But it is absolutely true. And that seems to me something that most people are not aware of. And like other adjustments we're making to things like greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, if we can make that point, we can make our small contribution to fixing those problems.
If there's something I can add, something else that was really shocking to me is that the Food and Agriculture Organization put out this report in, I think, 2015, and they said that if food loss and waste for a country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it would be number 3 after China and the US. So actually, the amount of organic matter that is wasted and sent to landfill and turns into methane in those landfills is really significant. So when we're having these conversations about climate change, a big piece of that is actually food waste. And it's a terrible thing that we don't really know. We haven't really quantified where it's coming from, but I think that more effort is being put into this in recent years. A lot of new research has come out since like 2011. It's been like exponential. So I'm really looking forward to new advances here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like us having these conversations is a very critical piece of the solution, just bringing the awareness up. And because it's such a diverse and such a complicated thing, I'm not going to be able to solve it, and leftovers are not going to be able to solve it. No individual is going to be able to solve it. So we need collaborative approaches and approaches that are widely adopted throughout the population, and awareness of it and pressure throughout the population. So it's one of the reasons I find a lot of meaning in having these conversations and opening them up. So I think we'll just go into one more set of questions, one for each of you. And that is, why do you care? Why is this important to you? Why have you chosen this to study?
I think, well, as a young person, I care a lot about, what the world is going to look like. And I consider this one of the things that I can try to do in my life to try to improve by having these talks, by trying to do this research, by working with governments and industry organizations, that I can try to improve this problem that hopefully will have positive effects for my community and for, people that come after me. So I've kind of dedicated a lot of time to this, and hopefully I'll continue to in the future. But I think it's very important. Food is something that we all share, that we all love, that we all need. And seeing it wasted is a terrible thing. So that's why it matters to me.
Thanks. I remember we had a conversation, our first conversation with regards to your studies, and it was so nice to hear that somebody's working on that. And it's like, okay, somebody's doing the research. I can do the logistics. This is okay. We're doing this. and to dedicate that. So thanks for continuing to invest. And Ellen, you've been in it for such a long time. What keeps you going, and why did you originally get involved?
I love everything about agriculture and food. It always seems so immediate to my life. I will tell you, I started studying marine biology at university, and I thought after 2 years, we were up to invertebrate, the smallest invertebrates that you could possibly imagine. And I thought, this is not relevant to my life, but food is. So I'm going to switch into agriculture. But I would say that one of the biggest drivers for me right now, particularly in the context of food waste, is that I'm embarrassed to live in Canada and have between 10 and 14% of the population of Canada food insecure. This is an appalling thing. I've worked with Saraya in India on other projects, and I understand the logistical problems around the food supply system there, and they're challenging and they need to be fixed. But Canada, we do not need to have this. And food waste is a key part of, think about those 10 to 14% of the population who are food insecure do not need to be food insecure if we didn't waste so much food. It's as simple as that.
And for those of you who don't know, that's 10 to 14% here. That's not somewhere else. That's in Canada, right? Yeah, 10 to 14%. We do have one more question that I almost missed. So thanks very much, Alicia, for bringing it out here. It is wondering what you think about stores like Costco, where people have to buy bulk and probably get a lot of it gets wasted. Thoughts?
I think it depends on the circumstance. If you have a large family, Costco makes a lot of sense. If you're able to manage that food, like if you know what to freeze and what recipes you have coming up, I think that makes a lot of sense too. There hasn't been a lot of research about bulk purchasing like for a company like Costco, but I think if you manage it right, that should be okay. But in the off chance where you're a single individual living by yourself and you're making purchases from Costco, I'm guessing that for a lot of that fresh produce, it's not managed completely perfectly and some of it will go to waste. So I think it depends on the scenario.
I totally agree. And I am a single person household now. And I can't even store the toilet paper if I had to buy it in the size at Costco. So I have no interest in a Costco membership.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Any other questions before we shut down? All right, with that, we will begin to close. And as has become custom with the WastED webinar, we will end it with some live accordion. That's all. Thanks so much for attending. Thanks very much for joining us. And thanks to all you folks for hanging out as well. Thanks to the folks on Zoom. And if you're listening to us on a podcast sometime from now, thanks for listening. Catch you later, folks.